On a cold February morning in 1943, somewhere in the Tunisian desert near a place called Kasserine Pass, a young German panzer commander named Hans Otto Behrendt watched through his field glasses as American tanks advanced toward his position. He had been fighting for 3 years. He had survived Poland, France, and the brutal Russian winter. He had seen the British Eighth Army fight at El Alamein. But these Americans were different. They came forward in rugged formations, bunched too closely together, their camouflage inadequate for the desert terrain. Their movements were clumsy, uncertain. Behrendt turned to his gunner and said something that thousands of German soldiers would echo in the coming days. "These are not soldiers. These are children playing at war." 3 days later, after the Battle of Kasserine Pass had ended in a devastating German victory, Behrendt's opinion had not changed. His unit had destroyed more than 100 American tanks. They had captured more than 1,000 prisoners. The Americans had broken and run, leaving behind their equipment, their ammunition, their wounded. It seemed to confirm everything German propaganda had been saying about the Americans: soft, undisciplined, more interested in comfort than combat. But Behrendt was an experienced enough soldier to understand that first battles told only part of the story. The Americans had excellent equipment, they had unlimited supplies, and they had something else, something he could not quite define but that troubled him nonetheless. They had learned quickly. Even in defeat, even in chaos, they had adapted. 27 months later, in May of 1945, Hans Otto Behrendt surrendered to American forces in Bavaria. The war was over, Germany was destroyed, and Behrendt's opinion of the American soldier had changed completely. In those 2 years and 3 months, he had watched the amateurs become professionals. He had seen them land at Normandy with a precision that took his breath away. He had fought them in the hedgerows of France, where they learned to use their firepower with devastating efficiency. He had survived their artillery barrages that turned entire forests into moonscapes. And in the final months, as Germany collapsed, he had watched American tanks roll through German towns with a confidence that spoke of absolute victory. When American MPs processed him as a prisoner of war, Behrendt was surprised by their professionalism, by the courtesy they showed even to defeated enemies. One young American lieutenant, who spoke decent German, asked him what he thought of American soldiers now. Behrendt thought for a long moment before answering. "You were not soldiers when you came to North Africa," he said. "You were not even soldiers when you landed in Normandy, but you became soldiers. You became very good soldiers, and you buried us under steel and fire until we could not fight anymore." This is the story of how German soldiers saw American troops during World War II. It is a story of contempt turning to grudging respect and eventually to something approaching awe at the sheer material power the Americans brought to bear. It is a story told through the eyes of men who fought against the United States Army and Marine Corps from the deserts of Tunisia to the ruins of Berlin. What did they really think of the men who defeated them? How did their opinions change as the war progressed? And what do those changing perceptions tell us about both armies, about the nature of modern war, and about the transformation of American military power in the 20th century? The answers matter because they reveal something fundamental about how wars are won and lost. The German Wehrmacht was arguably the finest military force in the world in 1939. Its soldiers were superbly trained, battle-hardened, led by officers who had studied war for generations. The American military in 1941 was ranked 17th in the world, behind Portugal. It was an army of farmers and factory workers, of men who had never seen combat, led by officers whose last battle experience had been in 1918. Yet within 4 years, this amateur force had helped destroy the German war machine. Understanding how the Germans perceived this transformation helps us understand how it happened. We will explore this evolution through multiple lenses. We will begin in the deserts of North Africa, where German and American forces first met in serious combat, and where the Germans inflicted a humiliating defeat on inexperienced American troops. We will examine how German soldiers viewed American equipment, American tactics, and American leadership. We will look at how those opinions changed in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, and in the final desperate battles for Germany itself. We will hear from German soldiers at every level, from privates in foxholes to field marshals in headquarters. We will explore how Germans compared Americans to their British and Soviet enemies, and we will look at the experience of German prisoners of war in American hands, which profoundly shaped German perceptions of their captors. This is not a simple story of one side being right and the other wrong. The Germans were correct about many American weaknesses, especially in the early years of the war. American troops were often poorly trained, their tactics sometimes amateurish, their leadership uneven. But the Germans also fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American military power. They saw individual tactical weaknesses and failed to grasp the strategic strengths that would ultimately matter more. They understood that Americans had more equipment, but failed to appreciate how effectively that equipment would be used. They recognized American resilience, but underestimated American learning. The story begins in Tunisia in the winter of 1943 with a battle that the Americans would rather forget, but that the Germans would remember as proof that quality mattered more than quantity. It begins with Kasserine Pass. The war in North Africa had been raging for nearly 3 years when American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942. Operation Torch was the first major American offensive against Nazi Germany, and it caught the Germans somewhat by surprise. Not because they were unaware that Americans might join the Mediterranean theater, but because they had not expected the Americans to be ready so soon. German intelligence had assured field commanders that the United States would need at least another year to build and train an army capable of serious combat operations. The landings in North Africa seemed to prove that assessment wrong. But as German forces in Tunisia began to encounter American units in combat, a different picture emerged. These were not the battle-hardened veterans who had driven Rommel from Egypt. These were green troops, many of whom had never heard a shot fired in anger. Their equipment was excellent, better than what most German units now possessed, but equipment alone did not make soldiers. That required training, experience, and the kind of iron discipline that came from facing death and learning to function despite fear. Major General Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox who commanded German forces in North Africa, watched the American advance with professional interest. He had spent years fighting the British and had developed a grudging respect for them as opponents. They were methodical, careful, and, when properly led, quite capable. But the British fought by the book, predictable in their caution. The Americans were an unknown quantity. Rommel needed to know what kind of army he was facing. He got his answer at a place called Kasserine Pass, a 2-mile-wide gap in the Grand Dorsal chain of the Atlas Mountains in west-central Tunisia. The pass was lightly defended by elements of the American Second Corps, inexperienced troops spread thin across difficult terrain. Rommel saw an opportunity. If he could break through the American lines, he might reach the vital supply bases at Tebessa and throw the entire Allied position into chaos. At minimum, he could bloody the Americans badly enough to delay their offensive and buy time for German forces to consolidate their position. The attack began on February 14, 1943. German tanks and infantry struck at Sidi Bouzid, 10 miles east of the pass. The American defenders from the 1st Armored Division were poorly positioned and uncoordinated. German panzers bypassed and surrounded American strongpoints, cutting off retreat routes and sowing confusion. When American armor counterattacked, it ran straight into prepared German positions. The slaughter was one-sided. More than 100 American tanks were destroyed. 1,500 American soldiers were captured. The survivors fell back in disorder. For German soldiers who had been told that Americans were soft and undisciplined, the battle seems to confirm every prejudice.
American tanks had advanced in bunched formations that made perfect targets. Their infantry had failed to properly reconnoiter the ground. Their communications had broken down under pressure. When the battle turned against them, some units had simply panicked and run. German after-action reports noted with satisfaction that American camouflage was poor, that they positioned themselves carelessly, that they seemed to have no understanding of how to fight in the desert. 2 days later, German forces struck at Kasserine Pass itself. The pass was defended by American and French troops who had no clear chain of command and no coordinated defensive plan. The defending general, Lloyd Fredendall, had set up his command post 70 miles behind the front lines in a bunker blasted into a mountainside by combat engineers. He issued contradictory orders, split his forces into penny packets, and never visited the front to see the terrain he was defending. When German panzers and panzer grenadiers assaulted the pass on February 19th, resistance collapsed. American soldiers abandoned their positions and streamed westward in retreat. The Germans advanced 50 miles in 3 days. German soldiers watching American prisoners march past could hardly believe these were the troops who would help defeat the Wehrmacht. They were well-fed, well-equipped, but they seemed to lack the hardness that combat required. A German lieutenant named Friedrich von Stauffenberg wrote in a letter home, "The Americans are not warriors. They have fine tanks and trucks, more food than we have seen in months, but they do not have the will to fight. When we pressed them, they broke. This war will be won by soldiers, not by factories." But Stauffenberg and thousands of German soldiers like him were missing something crucial in their assessment. The Americans were learning. Even as Kasserine Pass was being lost, American commanders were adapting. Artillery was being repositioned, reserves were being rushed forward, British armor was arriving to stiffen the line. And on February 22nd, when German forces tried to push through to Thala and Tebessa, they ran into something they had not expected: organized, determined resistance backed by overwhelming artillery fire. The American artillery at Kasserine was a preview of what would become the American way of war. When German tanks advanced, American forward observers called in fire from dozens of guns. Shells rained down in carefully orchestrated patterns, bracketing the German advance, forcing tanks to button up and infantry to take cover. The Germans had excellent artillery themselves, but they had never seen it used like this, with such abundance and such precision. One German officer reported that American artillery fire was the heaviest he had experienced in the entire war, including Russia. Rommel himself, after the battle, wrote an assessment that showed more nuance than many of his subordinates possessed. He noted that American defensive tactics were first class once they recovered from the initial shock. He observed that they had regrouped quickly and that the reserves had been positioned well enough to contain the German breakthrough. Most importantly, he recognized that American material superiority would grow with time. The factories that produced all that equipment would keep producing, the ships that brought supplies across the Atlantic would keep sailing, and the Americans would learn from their mistakes. The Battle of Kasserine Pass ended on February 24th, with Axis forces withdrawing to their starting positions. Tactically, it had been a German victory. They had inflicted far heavier casualties than they had suffered. They had demonstrated superior tactical skill, but strategically, Kasserine changed nothing. The Allied advance on Tunis continued. German forces in North Africa were trapped between the British 8th Army advancing from the east and American and British forces pressing from the west. The end was inevitable. What Kasserine did do was shape German perceptions of American soldiers for months to come. In countless German units across Tunisia, the story spread: the Americans are amateurs, badly led, quick to break under pressure. This comforting narrative would persist even as evidence to the contrary mounted. When American forces performed well in subsequent battles, some German soldiers dismissed it as the result of overwhelming material advantage rather than improving skill. The myth of American military incompetence born at Kasserine would die hard. But die it did, slowly and painfully, as German soldiers encountered Americans again and again and found them harder, more professional, more dangerous each time. By May 1943, when Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity. Many of them had fought against American units in the final battles, and many of them had learned what Rommel already knew. The Americans were getting better fast. The German soldiers captured in Tunisia found themselves on ships bound for the United States to prisoner of war camps scattered across America. What they discovered there would profoundly shape their understanding of the nation that had helped defeat them. They found a country so wealthy that even prisoners of war ate better than German civilians. They found guards who treated them according to the Geneva Convention, who saw them as soldiers rather than monsters. And slowly in those camps, many German prisoners began to understand that they had been defeated not by superior warriors, but by superior resources, superior logistics, and a democratic system that could mobilize those resources more effectively than any dictatorship. But that understanding would come later. In the spring of 1943, as German forces in Tunisia surrendered and Allied forces prepared to invade Sicily, most German soldiers still believed that American troops were second-rate opponents who could be beaten by superior German training and tactics. They were about to learn otherwise. If there was one aspect of American military power that German soldiers universally recognized and feared, it was firepower. Not individual marksmanship or small unit tactics, but the sheer overwhelming weight of explosive force that Americans could bring to bear on any target. Artillery, airstrikes, naval bombardment, tank guns, heavy machine guns. Americans fought, as one German veteran put it, not with soldiers but with steel. This was not meant as a compliment. German military doctrine emphasized maneuver, initiative, and the decisive action of well-trained infantry. The ideal German attack was swift, surgical, achieving maximum results with minimum expenditure of ammunition. This philosophy grew from necessity. Germany had limited resources, especially later in the war. German units could not afford to waste shells. Every round had to count. Americans fought differently. When they encountered resistance, they did not immediately try to outflank or infiltrate. They called for artillery, lots of artillery. American forward observers could direct fire from dozens of guns within minutes. Those guns could fire for hours, pounding German positions until resistance ceased or the Germans withdrew to avoid annihilation. Then the American infantry would advance, supported by tanks, encountering only shattered positions and shell-shocked defenders. To German soldiers accustomed to careful fire discipline, this seemed wasteful, even unsporting. A German lieutenant named Hans von Luck, who fought against American forces in North Africa and later in Normandy, described his first experience with American artillery. It was like nothing we had known, even in Russia. The Russians could mass artillery for major attacks, but the Americans did it routinely for the smallest objective. We would be defending a crossroads or small village, nothing of strategic importance, and the Americans would rain down hundreds, sometimes thousands of shells. Then their infantry would walk forward through the smoke and take positions we could no longer defend because we had no men left alive to defend them. The statistics support this assessment. American artillery fired more shells in World War II than any other nation. In some battles, American artillery expenditure exceeded that of all other combatants combined. During the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery fired more than 400,000 shells in a single day. In Normandy, American artillery sometimes fired over 1 million shells per week. German soldiers called it the Steel Hurricane. But it was not just the quantity that impressed and demoralized German troops, it was the quality of American fire control. American artillery was centralized, with forward observers able to call on all available guns, not just those of their own unit. This meant that any point on the battlefield could potentially be targeted by massed fire from multiple batteries. Americans also pioneered new techniques like time-on-target fire, where shells from different batteries at different distances were timed to arrive simultaneously, giving defenders no warning and no chance to take cover. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound of American forward observers on their radios. When they heard the Americans calling for fire, they knew they had perhaps 2 minutes to get into deep cover or pull back. Those who stayed in shallow foxholes or inadequate bunkers often did not survive. The concussive force of American artillery was so intense that men died from the blast wave alone, their bodies unmarked but their internal organs pulverized. Beyond artillery, there was American air power. The Luftwaffe had dominated European skies in 1940 and 1941, but by 1943, air superiority over the battlefield belonged to the Allies, and increasingly to the Americans specifically. German soldiers learned to dig deep and camouflage carefully because American fighter bombers hunted anything that moved during daylight hours. Erwin Rommel, who had commanded the Africa Corps with distinction, was profoundly affected by American air superiority. In North Africa, he had witnessed how Allied aircraft could nail to the ground an entire army. German forces could not move during the day without risking devastating airstrikes. Supply columns, tank concentrations, even individual vehicles became targets. Rommel wrote that the Allied air arm made conventional maneuver warfare impossible. You could plan the most brilliant tactical operation, but if enemy aircraft caught your forces in movement, the operation ended before it began. This experience shaped Rommel's thinking when he was later given responsibility for defending France against the coming Allied invasion. He insisted that the only way to defeat an amphibious landing was to stop it at the waterline in the first hours before Allied forces could establish air superiority over the beachhead. Once the Allies controlled the air, once their artillery was ashore, once their logistics network was established, defeating them would become mathematically impossible. German soldiers who survived American air attacks spoke with it something approaching awe. American fighter bombers did not just strafe columns and then leave. They circled, making repeated passes, hunting individual soldiers. They used rockets, bombs, napalm, and cannon fire. When a target was destroyed, they searched for more targets. A single American air attack could destroy an entire convoy, leaving the road littered with burning vehicles and dead men. Then there were the strategic bombers, the B-17s and B-24s that flew over Germany in formations of hundreds of aircraft, escorted by fighters, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German cities and industrial centers. German soldiers on leave from the front would return to find their hometowns reduced to rubble, their families killed or homeless. The psychological impact was immense. How could Germany win a war against a nation that could produce so many aircraft, train so many pilots, manufacture so many bombs? German assessments of American tanks were more nuanced. The Sherman tank, America's primary armored fighting vehicle, was inferior in several ways to German tanks like the Panther and Tiger. The Sherman had thinner armor. Its 75mm gun could not penetrate the frontal armor of heavy German tanks at normal combat ranges. In tank versus tank duels, German armor usually prevailed. But American tankers did not fight fair. They used their numerical superiority ruthlessly. For every German tank, there were 5 or 10 or 20 American tanks. German tank commanders might knock out 3 or 4 Shermans, but there were always more. And while Shermans could not easily penetrate German armor from the front, they could from the sides or rear. American tankers learned to use their numbers to flank German positions, to attack from multiple directions simultaneously.
Moreover, the Sherman was mechanically reliable in ways that German tanks often were not. Panthers broke down frequently, requiring extensive maintenance and spare parts that were increasingly difficult to obtain. Shermans just kept running. They were easy to repair, easy to maintain, and there were always more coming. A German tank commander might win a tactical victory, knocking out superior numbers of American tanks, only to fall back because his own tank had transmission problems or ran out of fuel. American logistics was perhaps the most profound difference between the two armies, and the one that German soldiers understood least. Every American unit was abundantly supplied with everything it needed. Food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, all arrived in quantities that amazed German troops. German units, especially later in the war, often fought on short rations with limited ammunition, scrounging for fuel and spare parts. When German soldiers captured American supply dumps, they could hardly believe what they found. Mountains of rations, more food than an entire German division would see in a month. Warehouses full of spare parts for vehicles, ammunition stacked everywhere, medical supplies in such abundance that Americans could afford to waste them. German soldiers sometimes ate captured American rations and marveled at the quality and variety. K-rations were better than what German frontline troops received. Coffee, chocolate, cigarettes,
all in quantities that spoke of a nation that could afford to keep its soldiers well fed and comfortable. This logistical superiority meant that American units could sustain operations longer, could absorb higher casualties and keep fighting, could maintain a tempo that exhausted German defenders. A German unit that fought hard and drove back an American attack could expect that attack to resume the next day, and the day after, and the day after that, because the Americans never ran out of shells, never ran short of reinforcements, never had to pause for lack of supplies. The German term for American military doctrine was Materialschlacht, the battle of materials. It was not entirely respectful. German military tradition valued individual skill, tactical brilliance, the decisive maneuver that won battles through superior generalship rather than superior resources. Americans, from the German perspective, did not fight cleverly. They fought with hammers, pounding away until resistance collapsed under the sheer weight of metal. But some German officers, particularly those with experience fighting Americans, came to respect this approach even as they deplored it. Hans von Luck, the German lieutenant who had scoffed at American artillery, later admitted, "We fought with skill and courage, they fought with steel and fire, and in the end, steel and fire won. Our tactical victories meant nothing when they could replace every loss 10 times over, and we could not replace any. They were not better soldiers, perhaps, but they were better supplied, better supported, and they used their advantages ruthlessly." This respect was grudging and often mixed with bitterness. German soldiers felt that Americans won not through superior fighting ability, but through overwhelming material advantage. There was truth in this. American tactics in the early years of the war were often mediocre. American small unit leadership was uneven. Individual German soldiers were frequently better trained, more experienced, more skilled. But war is not a contest of individual skill. It is a contest of nations, of industrial capacity, of logistical organization, of the ability to turn resources into military power and sustain that power over years of conflict. Americans understood this instinctively. They built an army designed to win through systematic application of superior firepower. They did not try to outmaneuver the Germans or outfight them soldier for soldier. They buried them under steel. For German soldiers on the receiving end, this was terrifying and frustrating in equal measure. They could win tactical victories and still be losing the war. They could demonstrate superior fighting ability and still be driven back, meter by meter, by an enemy that never ran out of ammunition, never stopped attacking, never gave up. The material giant was not invincible, but it was inexorable. And that, ultimately, was more dangerous. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 gave German forces a chance to observe American troops in a major amphibious operation. The lessons of Kasserine Pass were 2 months past. The Americans had had time to absorb those lessons, to replace incompetent commanders, to train their troops in hard-won tactical knowledge. When American soldiers came ashore in Sicily, they came as a different army than the one that had failed at Kasserine. German defenders on Sicily were not numerous. Much of the island's defense was left to Italian units, whose enthusiasm for the war had waned considerably. But there were German formations on the island, including elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. These troops fought with the skill and determination expected of German soldiers, and they noticed immediately that the Americans had changed. American landings were better coordinated. Amphibious operations were executed with a professionalism that surprised German observers. Naval gunfire support was devastating and accurate. American units moved inland with purpose, not the hesitation and confusion that had marked earlier operations. When German forces counterattacked, they found American defenders ready, dug in, with artillery support immediately available. The fighting in Sicily was intense, particularly around Gela and in the island's interior. German forces tried repeatedly to throw the Americans back into the sea, but could not break through. American firepower, especially naval guns and artillery, proved decisive. One German officer reported that attempting to attack American beachheads was suicidal. The volume of defensive fire was so intense that advancing forces were simply annihilated.
What impressed German soldiers most was American resilience. When positions were lost, Americans counterattacked to retake them. When supply lines were cut, Americans fought on with what they had until supply could be restored. There was a stubbornness to American units that had not been evident at Kasserine. They would not break, they would not panic. They would fight and keep fighting until they won or were completely destroyed. Sicily also showed German soldiers that American and British forces could cooperate effectively. The Sicily campaign was a combined operation, with American forces landing in the south and British forces in the east. Coordination between the two allies was not perfect, but was good enough to squeeze German forces off the island. By mid-August, all German troops had evacuated to the Italian mainland, having inflicted significant casualties but having lost the island nonetheless. The Italian campaign that followed Sicily was perhaps the most difficult fighting Americans faced in the European theater. Italy's mountainous terrain favored the defender. German forces under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring established defensive lines across the Italian peninsula that were masterpieces of military engineering. Monte Cassino, the Gustav Line, the Gothic Line, these were names that would haunt Allied veterans for the rest of their lives. At Monte Cassino, American troops faced some of the most brutal combat of the war. German paratroopers defended the monastery and surrounding heights with fanatical determination. American soldiers, many from the 36th Infantry Division, attacked repeatedly, suffering catastrophic casualties for minimal gains. German defenders fought from prepared positions, using the terrain masterfully, making the Americans pay for every meter of ground. It was at Monte Cassino and in the Italian mountains that German soldiers began to truly respect American infantry. This was not the artillery-dependent force of North Africa. This was hard, sustained infantry combat, attacking uphill against entrenched defenders, and the Americans kept coming. German reports from Monte Cassino noted with surprise that American soldiers showed considerable bravery and that their small unit leadership had improved dramatically. The landing at Anzio in January 1944 was another test of American capabilities. The landing itself was a success, catching German forces off guard, but the subsequent failure to break out of the beachhead gave German forces time to contain the Allied force. For 4 months, Americans and British fought in a compressed pocket, subjected to constant German artillery fire and counterattacks. German soldiers who fought at Anzio came away with mixed impressions. They noted that Americans could execute complex amphibious operations with skill. They observed that American defensive positions were well constructed and stubbornly defended, but they also saw that American commanders could be overly cautious, missing opportunities for decisive action. Throughout the Italian campaign, German soldiers developed a grudging respect for American fighting ability. The Italian terrain favored defense so heavily that even superior numbers and firepower could not guarantee quick victory. Americans had to learn to fight in mountains, to assault fortified positions, to endure artillery bombardments and counterattacks. And they learned. Slowly, at terrible cost, but they learned. One German veteran of the Italian campaign, a sergeant named Wolfgang Schneider, later recalled, "In Africa, we thought the Americans were soft. In Sicily, we thought they were merely well-equipped. But in Italy, we learned they were stubborn. They would not quit. No matter how many times we threw them back, they came again. Their generals were sometimes foolish, attacking where they should not, but their soldiers would attack anywhere they were ordered, and they would die rather than retreat without orders." This was perhaps the critical evolution in German perceptions. The contempt of Kasserine had given way to a more nuanced understanding. Americans might not be natural soldiers in the Prussian mold. They might prefer to rely on firepower rather than maneuver, but they were determined, increasingly competent, and backed by resources that made them nearly impossible to defeat in sustained combat. The Italian campaign also showed Germans that Americans were not simply imitating British methods. The American approach to war was distinctly their own, more aggressive than the British in some ways, more willing to accept casualties to achieve objectives, less concerned with elegance or tactical brilliance, more focused on systematic application of superior force. The American way of war was taking shape, and it was proving effective. By the spring of 1944, as Allied forces finally broke through the Gustav Line and advanced on Rome, German forces in Italy had learned what their comrades in North Africa had learned. Americans could be beaten in individual battles, but not in campaigns. American resources were too vast, American determination too strong, American learning too quick.
The best German units in Italy were being ground down, suffering casualties they could not replace, expending ammunition they could not replenish, while American strength only grew. The capture of Rome in June 1944 was a symbolic victory for the Allies. For German soldiers who had fought across Italy, it was confirmation that the war was lost. If Americans could sustain a campaign for nearly a year across the most difficult terrain in Europe, breaking through defensive positions that should have been impregnable, what would they do in France, where the terrain was more favorable to attackers? The answer would come soon enough, on the beaches of Normandy.
In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, thousands of Allied paratroopers dropped into Normandy behind German coastal defenses. At first light, the largest amphibious invasion in history began, with American, British, and Canadian forces hitting 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. For German forces defending France, it was the moment they had prepared for since 1942. For German soldiers in the coastal defenses, it was the beginning of a nightmare from which there would be no waking. German expectations before D-Day were complex. Senior officers like Rommel understood that once the Allies secured a beachhead and established air superiority, ejecting them would be nearly impossible. But many German soldiers, particularly those who had not fought Americans before, still held to the comforting belief that German tactical superiority would prevail. They had been told that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. They had been promised that panzer divisions would crush any landing force before it could consolidate. They believed, because they needed to believe, that Germany could win the war. The reality of D-Day shattered these beliefs. The scale of the Allied operation was beyond anything German defenders had imagined. Naval bombardment from battleships and cruisers turned coastal defenses into rubble. Air attacks destroyed communication lines and prevented reinforcements from reaching the beaches. And then came the landing craft, hundreds of them, thousands of them, disgorging men and vehicles in waves that seemed endless. German soldiers in the coastal fortifications fought with determination and skill. At Omaha Beach, American troops faced the most intense resistance. The defending German regiment, the 352nd Infantry Division, was well positioned and well led. They turned Omaha Beach into a killing ground. American casualties were horrific. For several hours, the landing seemed on the verge of failure. But the Americans did not retreat. Despite terrible losses, despite chaos and confusion, despite watching friends torn apart by machine gun fire and artillery, American soldiers kept moving forward. They found cover in the seawall, reorganized in small groups, and began working their way up the bluffs. Destroyer escorts came so close to shore they risked grounding, firing point-blank at German strongpoints. Slowly, meter by meter, American soldiers clawed their way off the beach and onto the high ground. German defenders at Omaha reported with astonishment that Americans, despite suffering casualties that should have broken any attack, kept coming. A German lieutenant named Franz Gockel later said, "We killed so many. The beach was covered with bodies, but still they came. It was not courage, exactly. It was something more mechanical, more relentless. They had been trained to advance, and they advanced, even into machine gun fire, even over the bodies of their dead comrades." By nightfall on June 6th, American forces had secured a foothold on Omaha Beach. The other beaches had been taken with lighter casualties. The invasion had succeeded. German forces had inflicted heavy losses but had failed to throw the Allies back into the sea. And with each passing hour, Allied strength ashore increased, while German ability to counterattack decreased. The battles in the Normandy hedgerows over the following weeks were some of the most intense of the entire war. The bocage country of Normandy, with its small fields divided by ancient earthen banks topped with thick hedges, was a defender's paradise. Every field was a potential fortress. Every hedgerow concealed machine guns and mortars. Advancing across this terrain against skilled German defenders cost the Americans dearly. German soldiers who fought in the bocage developed a more complex view of American tactical abilities. Americans were still too reliant on firepower, still too willing to call for artillery when maneuver might have worked better, but they were learning to fight in close country. They developed new tactics, using tanks equipped with hedge cutters to break through the bocage. They learned to use small unit infiltration tactics. They coordinated infantry and armor more effectively. More importantly, Americans showed an ability to adapt that impressed even their enemies. When standard tactics failed in the bocage, Americans tried new approaches.
Tank-infantry cooperation improved dramatically. Artillery was used more precisely, with forward observers sometimes within meters of the targets. American soldiers began to show the kind of small unit initiative that German doctrine prized, but that had been lacking in earlier American operations. A German commander named Paul Carrel wrote in his diary, "The Americans fight differently now. In Africa, they were clumsy. In Italy, they were stubborn. Here in Normandy, they are becoming skilled. They still prefer to use artillery when we would use maneuver, but they use their artillery with devastating effect. And their infantry, when it attacks with a determination that is almost German in its intensity." The American breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, Operation Cobra, demonstrated how far American operational art had evolved. The operation began with the heaviest carpet bombing of the war, American aircraft dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German positions. Then American armor poured through the gap, racing south and west, cutting off German forces in Brittany, swinging east toward Paris. German forces tried to counterattack at Mortain, but were destroyed by American defensive fire and air attacks. The Falaise Pocket, where German forces tried to escape encirclement, became a killing ground where Allied air power destroyed entire divisions. German soldiers who survived the pocket spoke of it with horror. They had been trapped in a closing vise, pounded by artillery from the ground and aircraft from the sky, unable to retreat, unable to advance, dying by the thousands. For German soldiers, Normandy was a revelation. This was not the amateur American army of Tunisia. This was a professional force, well-led, well-supplied, and absolutely determined. American generals like Patton drove their forces with an aggression that matched or exceeded German commanders. American soldiers fought with a tenacity that came from good training and growing experience. And American material superiority was so overwhelming that no amount of German tactical skill could overcome it. One German veteran, a panzer crewman named Hans von Luck, described an American attack in Normandy. "We came forward behind a curtain of artillery fire. We could not see them through the smoke and dust. When the artillery lifted, their tanks appeared, many tanks, more than we could count. We knocked out the first wave and the second, but there was always a third wave and a fourth. Our tank was hit 3 times before it finally burned. We were lucky to escape. Most of my crew did not." The campaign in Normandy cost the Germans irreplaceable losses. Elite panzer divisions were destroyed or reduced to shadows. The Luftwaffe was swept from the skies. The Wehrmacht's tactical superiority, so pronounced at Kasserine Pass, had been eroded by American learning and overwhelmed by American material power. By the time Paris was liberated in late August 1944, German soldiers in France understood that they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that was becoming more dangerous every week. The respect German soldiers had developed for American fighting ability often mixed with bitterness. They felt that they were better soldiers, individually superior in training and tactical skill. But individual superiority meant nothing when the Americans could replace every casualty 10 times over, and the Germans could not replace any. It meant nothing when American artillery could fire unlimited ammunition, while German guns were rationed to a few rounds per day. It meant nothing when American aircraft owned the sky and German forces could not move by daylight. But beneath the bitterness was a growing acceptance of reality. The Americans had arrived as amateurs and had become professionals. They had learned from every mistake, adapted to every challenge, and used their vast resources with increasing efficiency. The transformation that Rommel had warned about had occurred. The Americans were no longer children playing at war. They had become soldiers, and they were winning.
Beyond tactics and equipment, German soldiers formed opinions about the character of individual American troops, the kind of men they were as soldiers and as human beings. These assessments were complex, shaped by propaganda, personal experience, and the evolving reality of combat. German propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, decadent, corrupted by democracy and racial mixing, lacking the discipline and warrior spirit that National Socialist ideology claimed to instill in German soldiers. Americans, the propaganda said, were motivated only by material comfort. They would fight only when conditions were safe and convenient. When faced with determined resistance, they would fold. Combat experience contradicted this propaganda. American soldiers were not soft.
They endured the same hardships as German troops, lived in the same foxholes, ate the same cold rations, suffered the same terror under artillery fire. They did not fold under pressure. If anything, American soldiers showed a stubbornness that surprised German troops accustomed to facing opponents who would retreat when outnumbered or outgunned. But there were real differences in how American and German soldiers approached war. German military culture emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and formal discipline. Officers maintained strict social distance from enlisted men. Orders were to be followed without question. Individual initiative was valued, but only within the framework of established doctrine and command authority. American military culture was more informal. Officers and enlisted men maintained a professional relationship, but without the rigid class distinctions common in European armies. American soldiers felt free to question orders, at least informally, and expected their officers to explain the reasons for decisions. German soldiers, observing this informality, sometimes interpreted it as lack of discipline. A German sergeant captured in France told his interrogators, "American soldiers talk back to their officers. They argue, they complain. This would be unthinkable in the German army. But I noticed that when the officers gave orders to attack, the men attacked. When told to hold a position, they held it. So perhaps their discipline is different from ours, but it is discipline nonetheless." This was perceptive. American discipline was based less on fear of punishment and more on mutual respect between officers and men, on a sense of shared purpose, on the understanding that everyone was in the war together. American officers who led from the front, who shared their men's dangers, commanded fierce loyalty. American officers who hid in bunkers while their men died were despised and sometimes fragged. German soldiers also noted the quality of American small unit leadership, which improved dramatically as the war progressed. Early in the war, American junior officers and NCOs often lacked experience and made costly mistakes. By 1944, American squads and platoons were led by veterans who knew their business. These leaders used combined arms effectively, coordinated with armor and artillery, and showed tactical flexibility that impressed German opponents. The relationship between American officers and enlisted men puzzled some German soldiers, but earned grudging respect from others. A German lieutenant captured at the Bulge observed, "American sergeants speak to lieutenants as if they were equals. American soldiers call their officers by their first names when no senior officers are present. But when I watched them in combat, I saw that orders were followed, that men obeyed their leaders. Perhaps their way works for them, even if it would not work for us." American aggressiveness in combat was something German soldiers had not expected based on propaganda. The stereotype of the cautious, comfort-seeking American did not match the reality of American soldiers attacking through artillery fire, refusing to retreat even when outnumbered, counterattacking immediately after defensive victories. A German infantryman who fought at Normandy said, "They told us Americans would not fight, but these Americans fought like devils. When we pushed them back, they came forward again. When we held a position, they found a way around or called down so much artillery that we could not hold any longer." This aggressiveness was particularly notable when American units were defending. German tactical doctrine emphasized counterattack, hitting enemy forces while they were still disorganized from their assault. But when German forces counterattacked American positions, they often found American troops ready, with artillery already registered on likely approach routes, with tanks positioned to cover flanks, with reserves ready to plug any breakthrough. One German officer said, "Americans defend aggressively. They do not wait for us to attack. They meet our attacks with fire and immediate counterattack. This is not what we expected from a democratic army." Race was another dimension of German perceptions. Nazi ideology taught that racial mixing weakened nations, that multiracial armies would lack cohesion. When German soldiers encountered African American troops in combat, some expected to find inferior soldiers. The reality was different. Black American units fought with the same determination and skill as white units, despite facing discrimination within their own army. German propaganda tried to exploit American racial divisions, dropping leaflets encouraging African American troops to question why they were fighting for a country that denied them basic rights. Some German soldiers genuinely believed that Black American troops would be unreliable in combat. Those who actually fought against units like the 92nd Infantry Division or the 761st Tank Battalion learned otherwise. African American soldiers were as well equipped, as well trained, and as determined as any American troops. A German corporal recalled in Italy, "We were told the Negro soldiers would not fight. We attacked their positions expecting easy victory. They killed half my company. They fought as well as any American soldiers we had encountered. After that battle, we did not believe what the propaganda told us." American treatment of prisoners was another factor shaping German perceptions. Germans captured by American forces were generally treated according to the Geneva Convention. They were given medical care for their wounds, fed adequately, transported to rear areas where they were processed and eventually sent to prisoner of war camps in America. This was not universal. There were instances of American soldiers shooting prisoners, particularly in the heat of battle or in retaliation for German atrocities, but the general pattern was humane treatment. This contrasted sharply with what German soldiers had been told to expect. Propaganda had warned that Americans would torture and murder prisoners, that surrender meant death. When German soldiers discovered that surrender actually meant safety, food, and eventual transport to prisoner of war camps in America, it affected their willingness to fight to the last. By late 1944, many German soldiers were looking for opportunities to surrender to Americans rather than to Soviets, whom they feared would be far less merciful. The character of American soldiers, as perceived by Germans who fought them, was thus a mixture of strengths and weaknesses, of contradictions that made sense only when understood in the context of American culture. Americans were informal in manner, but effective in combat. They relied heavily on material superiority, but fought tenaciously when that superiority was neutralized. They came from a democratic society that German soldiers had been taught to despise, yet they fought with a determination that matched or exceeded German troops. Perhaps the most telling assessment came from a German colonel captured in the final weeks of the war. When asked what he thought of American soldiers, he said, "They are not soldiers in the way we understand the term. They lack our tradition, our discipline in the Prussian sense. But they are effective. They learn quickly. They use their advantages ruthlessly, and they have one quality that perhaps matters more than all others. They do not give up. No matter how many times you defeat them, they come back. That is the quality that wins wars."
German soldiers did not fight in isolation. They faced Americans, British, Canadians, Soviets, and soldiers from dozens of other nations. Their assessments of American troops were inevitably shaped by comparisons to these other enemies. What did Germans think of Americans compared to the British? How did Americans measure up against the Soviets? And what did these comparisons reveal about the different Allied armies? The Germans had been fighting the British since 1940. 4 years of combat had given German soldiers a clear understanding of British military capabilities. The British were seen as professional, competent, well-led at tactical levels, but sometimes overly cautious at operational levels. British soldiers were brave and determined, particularly when defending. British combined arms coordination was excellent, but British commanders were sometimes predictable, attacking only when they had overwhelming superiority, reluctant to take risks. A German veteran of the North African campaign said, "The British were good soldiers, very professional, but they would not attack unless they were certain of victory. Montgomery would mass his forces, assemble enormous amounts of artillery, ensure air superiority, and only then attack. His attacks were methodical, careful, almost scientific. We respected this, but we also knew that British caution could be exploited. If we could make them uncertain, they would pause." Americans, in German eyes, were less professional than the British, but more aggressive. American commanders were willing to take risks that British commanders would reject. Patton, in particular, was seen by German officers as dangerous precisely because he was unpredictable, willing to gamble, prone to attacking even when circumstances were not ideal. This aggressiveness sometimes led to American failures, but it also created opportunities that more cautious commanders would have missed. A German general captured in France told his interrogators, "Montgomery will not attack until he is certain he cannot lose.
Patton will attack when he thinks he can win. This makes Patton more dangerous because he creates situations where we must react rather than where we can plan. We could predict Montgomery, we could rarely predict Patton. At the tactical level, German soldiers saw less difference between American and British troops. Both were well-equipped, well-supplied, backed by superior artillery and air power. Both showed courage in combat. But there were subtle distinctions. British infantry were seen as more methodical, more disciplined in their attacks. American infantry were seen as more improvisational, more willing to try new tactics if standard approaches failed. The comparison to Soviet forces was starker. The Eastern Front was a different war entirely. German soldiers who fought in Russia faced enemies who outnumbered them vastly, who attacked in human waves, who seemed to care nothing for casualties. Soviet soldiers were hardy, accustomed to privation, capable of fighting effectively under conditions that would have broken Western armies. But Soviet equipment was often inferior, Soviet tactics sometimes crude, and Soviet treatment of prisoners so brutal that German soldiers fought desperately to avoid capture. A German soldier who fought on both fronts said, "In Russia, we faced men who fought like animals, savage and relentless. They attacked in masses, absorbing casualties that would have broken any Western army. In France, we faced men who fought like engineers. They used mathematics. They calculated how much firepower was needed to destroy a position, then applied that firepower until the position was destroyed. Both were terrifying in their own ways." This comparison was not entirely fair to Soviet forces, who developed sophisticated tactics and operational art as the war progressed, but it reflected a common German perception. Soviets won through mass and endurance, accepting horrific casualties to achieve objectives. Americans won through firepower and logistics, minimizing their own casualties through maximizing enemy casualties through artillery and airstrikes. German soldiers generally preferred being captured by Americans or British rather than Soviets. Western allies treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. Soviets, whose own prisoners had been murdered by the millions, showed little mercy to German captures. This preference shaped German behavior in the final months of the war, as units on the Eastern Front desperately tried to retreat westward to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. The comparison to Italian troops was unflattering to Italy. By 1943, Italian troops had largely lost faith in Mussolini's regime and had little enthusiasm for the war. Italian units defending Sicily and the Italian mainland often surrendered quickly when faced with determined attacks. German soldiers, who found themselves having to prop up Italian defenses, developed little respect for Italian military capabilities. This made German respect for American and British forces more significant. Germans saw the Western allies as worthy opponents, capable of matching or exceeding German military skill. What these comparisons reveal is that German soldiers, despite their propaganda-fed prejudices, were capable of objective military assessments. They recognized that British forces were professionally competent, that Soviet forces were formidable despite their losses, and that American forces were evolving into a genuinely dangerous opponent. The evolution of German perceptions of Americans from contempt to respect occurred within this context of comparative assessment. By 1945, when the question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but only how quickly, German soldiers were unanimous in preferring surrender to Americans or British over surrender to Soviets. This was not because they respected the Western Allies less, it was because they respected the Western Allies' adherence to the rules of war. Germans had violated those rules repeatedly on the Eastern Front and knew that Soviets would exercise revenge. But they believed, mostly correctly, that Americans and British would treat prisoners humanely. This belief shaped German strategy in the final months of the war. German forces in the East fought desperate delaying actions, while forces in the West sometimes retreated with deliberate speed, trading space for time, hoping to hold out until they could surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. Some German generals even considered negotiating separate peace with the Western Allies to continue fighting only against the Soviets. These negotiations went nowhere, but the fact that Germans preferred American captivity to Soviet captivity spoke volumes about which enemy they respected and which they feared.
The pursuit across France in the late summer of 1944 was one of the most dramatic campaigns of the war. Following the breakout from Normandy, American, British, and French forces raced eastward, liberating Paris in late August and pushing toward the German frontier. German forces retreated in disorder, trying to establish new defensive lines, falling back toward the Rhine. For German soldiers, this was a period of confusion and demoralization. Units that had fought skillfully in Normandy disintegrated under the relentless American advance, supply lines collapsed, communication broke down, orders from higher headquarters often bore no relation to reality on the ground, and everywhere American tanks appeared, cutting roads, overrunning supply dumps, forcing German units to surrender or scatter. American pursuit tactics impressed German officers even as they destroyed German armies. American mechanized divisions moved with a speed that rivaled German blitzkrieg operations of 1940. Patton's Third Army advanced so rapidly that German commanders could not track its positions. When German units tried to establish defensive lines, they found American tanks already behind them, having bypassed strong points and driven deep into the rear. A German colonel captured during the pursuit said, "Patton fights like a German general. He moves fast, he takes risks, he does not wait for perfect conditions. If we had fought Americans led by Patton from the beginning, the war in the West would have ended sooner." But the pursuit could not continue indefinitely. As Allied forces approached the German frontier, their supply lines stretched thin. The massive logistical effort required to keep armies advancing hundreds of miles beyond their ports and supply bases began to falter. By September 1944, American and British forces were outrunning their supplies. Fuel became scarce, ammunition was rationed, the advance slowed and then stopped. German forces used this pause to reconstitute their defenses. New divisions were formed from rear area troops and convalescent wounded. The West Wall, Germany's pre-war defensive line along the frontier, was reoccupied and strengthened. By October, Allied forces were facing organized resistance again. The war that had seemed nearly won was clearly going to continue into winter. It was in this context that Hitler planned his final major offensive in the West, a counterattack through the Ardennes forest designed to split Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. The operation, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Germany's last gamble in the West. The attack began on December 16, 1944. More than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks struck at a weakly held sector of the American lines in the Ardennes. The initial German assault achieved complete surprise. American positions were overrun, entire units were surrounded and forced to surrender. Within days, German forces had opened a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines. German soldiers involved in the offensive felt a resurgence of hope. They were attacking again, advancing, winning local victories. The Americans seemed confused, unable to coordinate their response. For a few days, it felt like 1940 again, like the early years of the war when German arms had seemed invincible. But the Battle of the Bulge revealed how much had changed since 1940. American forces, though initially surprised and pushed back, did not collapse. Key road junctions like St. Vith and Bastogne were defended stubbornly, slowing the German advance. American commanders, including Eisenhower and Bradley, reacted quickly, rushing reinforcements to threatened sectors. Patton's Third Army, attacking from the south, relieved Bastogne and began pushing back German forces. Most critically, when weather cleared and Allied aircraft could fly again, German forces were subjected to devastating air attacks. American and British fighter bombers hunted German columns, destroying tanks and vehicles, making movement by daylight suicidal. The Luftwaffe, making a rare appearance, was overwhelmed and driven from the skies. German soldiers who had hoped that the offensive would change the war's trajectory instead watched their offensive power bleed away under Allied air and artillery fire.
German assessments of American performance in the Bulge were mixed. Americans had been surprised and had given ground, but they had recovered quickly, had fought skillfully in defense, and had counterattacked effectively. A German Panzer officer said, "In 1940, when we broke through Allied lines, the French army collapsed. Here, the Americans gave ground but maintained coherence. They held the shoulders of our penetration. They used their artillery expertly, and when their air force could fly, our offensive was doomed." The stubborn defense of Bastogne particularly impressed German forces. The town was surrounded, its defenders cut off, subjected to constant attacks, but the American paratroopers and armor units defending Bastogne did not surrender. When the German commander demanded surrender, the American general, Anthony McAuliffe, replied with a single word: nuts. The defense held until Patton's forces broke through. German soldiers who fought at Bastogne came away with deep respect for American determination. These were not the green troops of Kasserine Pass. These were veterans who knew their business, who fought with skill and courage, who would not quit even when surrounded and outnumbered. A German infantry sergeant said, "We attacked Bastogne again and again. We killed many Americans, but we could not take the town. They fought for every building, every street. When we pushed them back, they counterattacked. Even when we cut them off, they held. These are soldiers." By late January 1945, a Battle of the Bulge was over. German forces had been pushed back to their starting positions. They had suffered more than 100,000 casualties, losses in men and equipment they could not replace. The offensive had failed completely. Rather than splitting the Allied armies, it had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves and hastened the end of the war. The pursuit resumed in early 1945, but now Allied forces were advancing into Germany itself. The Rhine, the great natural barrier protecting Germany's heartland, was crossed in multiple places in March. American, British, and Soviet forces were converging on Berlin from 3 directions. German resistance became increasingly desperate and futile. German soldiers fighting on their own soil faced impossible odds. American forces now included veteran divisions that had been fighting since North Africa. American armor, artillery, and air power were used with a sophistication that would have been unthinkable in 1942. German units fought hard, but they were broken units, under strength, poorly supplied, facing an enemy that grew stronger every day. In the final battles, German perceptions of American soldiers reached their final evolution. There was no longer contempt, no longer dismissiveness. There was recognition that Americans had become formidable soldiers, that the amateur army of 1942 had transformed into a professional force, capable of matching German tactical skill and overwhelming German resistance through superior resources and logistics. A German lieutenant who surrendered in April said, "When the Americans came to North Africa, we laughed at them. They were clumsy, badly led, easy to defeat. But they learned from every mistake. They became harder with each battle. By the time they crossed the Rhine, they were as good as any army in the world. We were perhaps still better individual soldiers, but they had more of everything, and they knew how to use what they had. We could no longer match them." This was the final assessment, reached through nearly 3 years of combat. American soldiers, supported by overwhelming material superiority and increasingly skillful leadership, had become an unstoppable force. The transformation from the disaster at Kasserine Pass to the victories of 1945 was complete.
More than 400,000 German soldiers spent time in prisoner of war camps in the United States during World War II. Their experiences as prisoners profoundly shaped their perceptions of America and Americans. What they found in American POW camps often contradicted everything they had been told about the United States. The journey to America began with capture. German soldiers who surrendered to American forces in Europe were processed at collection points, interrogated, and eventually transported to ports where they were loaded onto ships bound for the United States. The voyage across the Atlantic was often their first real exposure to American abundance. They were fed better than they had eaten in months, sometimes years. Medical care was provided for wounds. The treatment was generally humane, following the Geneva Convention. Upon arrival in the United States, German POWs were distributed to camps across the country.
More than 700 camps were established, most of them in rural areas where German labor could be used in agriculture. The prisoners found themselves in a country that seemed impossibly wealthy, a country untouched by bombing, where civilians lived in comfort that would have seemed luxurious to Germans struggling under Allied air raids. The camps themselves varied in quality, but most provided adequate housing, regular meals, and access to recreation. German POWs received the same rations as American soldiers, as required by the Geneva Convention. For many prisoners, this meant eating better than they had as frontline troops. Meat was served regularly, coffee was available, there was plenty of bread. A German prisoner captured in Tunisia wrote home, "When I was captured, I weighed 128 pounds. After 2 years as an American POW, I weighed 185. I had gotten so fat you could no longer see my eyes." The abundance amazed German prisoners. They received chocolate and cigarettes in quantities they had not seen since before the war. They could purchase additional items at camp canteens using wages earned from labor. The contrast to conditions in Germany, where civilians were starving and cities were being reduced to rubble, was stark. Beyond material comfort, German prisoners were struck by how they were treated. American guards generally followed the Geneva Convention. Prisoners were not beaten or abused. Officers and NCOs among the prisoners maintained discipline within the camps, with American oversight. Germans organized their own activities, from sports teams to educational classes to theatrical productions. This humane treatment had strategic purpose. The United States wanted to ensure that American prisoners in German hands received similar treatment. By treating German prisoners well, America hoped to encourage reciprocal treatment. Additionally, American authorities believed that well-treated prisoners would work harder and cause fewer problems. The effect on German prisoners was significant. Many had expected to be tortured or murdered. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as cruel and barbaric. When German prisoners instead found themselves treated as human beings, even with a certain respect, it challenged everything they had been taught about their enemies. Some German prisoners reported being treated better by Americans than they had been by their own officers. The informal relationship between American officers and enlisted men, which had puzzled German soldiers in combat, was even more evident in POW camps. American guards sometimes chatted with prisoners, shared cigarettes, showed photographs of their families. This casual equality was foreign to German military culture, but made a deep impression. German prisoners working in agriculture often had contact with American civilians. They found Americans curious but generally friendly. Farmers who employed German labor sometimes invited them to meals. Small-town Americans treated German prisoners as unfortunate men caught up in a war, not as monsters. This contradicted the propaganda image of Americans as degenerate and hateful. The experience of African American guards was particularly instructive for German prisoners. Nazi ideology had taught that black people were inferior, that multiracial societies were weak and chaotic. But German prisoners observed that black American guards were as professional and effective as white guards, that they commanded respect within the military structure, that racial mixing had not produced the chaos Nazi propaganda predicted. One German prisoner, asked about his experience with African American guards, said, "We had been told many things about Negroes that proved to be lies. The black soldiers who guarded us were soldiers like any others. They did their duty. They treated us fairly." I began to understand that much of what we had been taught was propaganda meant to make us hate our enemies. The re-education program attempted by American authorities had mixed results. Some German prisoners, particularly those who had been dedicated Nazis, remained unconvinced by American democracy. But many prisoners, particularly younger soldiers who had been drafted rather than volunteering, were open to new ideas. Educational programs, access to uncensored newspapers, and the evidence of their own eyes showed them that democracy could work, that America was not the decadent wasteland Nazi propaganda had portrayed. After the war, when German prisoners were repatriated, many of them carried home a changed view of America. Some had been so impressed by what they saw that they later emigrated to the United States. Thousands of former German POWs returned to America to visit the places where they had been imprisoned, reconnecting with Americans who had treated them well during their captivity. One former prisoner, Günter Grav, returned to the United States 70 years after his imprisonment to thank Americans for the treatment he had received. In a letter, he wrote about standing in a camp canteen in 1944, trying to decide whether to buy ice cream or Coca-Cola first, luxuries he had not seen in Germany in years. He said his time as a prisoner in America was the best treatment he had received in the entire war. Not all German prisoners had positive experiences. There were instances of abuse, of guards who hated Germans and took out that hatred on prisoners. There were overcrowded camps, inadequate facilities, harsh conditions. But the overall pattern was one of humane treatment, particularly when compared to how German prisoners were treated in Soviet camps or how Allied prisoners were treated in German camps. The contrast was especially stark with Soviet treatment of German prisoners. Millions of German soldiers captured on the Eastern Front were sent to labor camps in the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands died from starvation, disease, and brutal treatment. German soldiers on both fronts knew this, which is why so many German units in the East fought desperately to retreat westward to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. What German prisoners told their comrades about American captivity shaped German military behavior in the final months of the war. As resistance became futile, German soldiers increasingly sought opportunities to surrender to Americans. They passed the word that Americans treated prisoners well, fed them adequately, transported them safely to rear areas. This information, more than any propaganda, encouraged German soldiers to give up rather than fight to the death. The prisoner experience thus became part of the larger story of German perceptions of Americans. Soldiers who had fought Americans and then been captured by them often came away with respect not just for American military power, but for American values. They had seen that Americans, despite their overwhelming strength, adhered to rules, treated enemies humanely, and distinguished between German soldiers and Nazi ideology. This was perhaps the most profound shift in German perceptions, the recognition that American power was not just material, but moral, that Americans fought not just with steel and fire, but with a set of principles that made their victory more than just a military fact. It was a cultural and political victory, a demonstration that democracy could mobilize resources more effectively than dictatorship, could inspire greater loyalty than totalitarianism, and could show mercy even to defeated enemies.
The views of German generals and high-ranking officers about American military capabilities often differed from those of frontline soldiers. Senior officers saw strategic patterns that individual soldiers could not perceive. They understood how industrial capacity, logistical systems, and operational art combined to determine outcomes. Their assessments of American forces were shaped by professional analysis as well as battlefield experience. Erwin Rommel, perhaps Germany's most famous field commander, had extensive experience fighting against Western allies, including Americans. His assessment of American forces evolved throughout the war. After Kasserine Pass, Rommel acknowledged that while Americans had fought poorly at the tactical level, their defensive recovery had been first class. He noted that Americans had regrouped quickly and used reserves effectively to contain the German breakthrough. More importantly, Rommel understood that American material superiority would eventually prove decisive. He had seen in North Africa how Allied air power could paralyze an army, making maneuver impossible. He wrote that the Allied air arm had made conventional warfare obsolete. No amount of tactical skill could overcome the reality that the enemy controlled the skies and could destroy any force that tried to move by day. This experience shaped Rommel's thinking about defending against the coming Allied invasion of France. He believed that the only way to defeat the invasion was to destroy it at the waterline in the first hours before Allied forces could establish air superiority and bring their logistics ashore.
Once the Allies were established on the continent, Rommel argued, defeating them would become mathematically impossible. Their material superiority would simply overwhelm German resistance. Rommel's superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had a different perspective. Von Rundstedt was a traditional Prussian officer, one of the most senior and respected generals in the German army. He had commanded armies since the invasion of Poland and had been Germany's commander in the West since 1942. His opinion of American forces was measured and professional. Von Rundstedt recognized that American generals sometimes made mistakes, that American tactics were not always elegant, that American soldiers lacked the training and tradition of German troops. But he also recognized that these deficiencies mattered less than most German officers believed. American industrial capacity was so vast that tactical losses were irrelevant. American logistics were so efficient that German attempts to cut supply lines were futile. American determination was such that defeating them in individual battles did not change the overall strategic situation. When asked after the war what he thought of American military leadership, von Rundstedt said that while American tactical commanders were sometimes mediocre, American strategic planning was excellent. He noted that Americans understood logistics and industrial mobilization in ways that Germans did not. The American army was not built to win individual battles through tactical brilliance. It was built to win campaigns through systematic application of superior resources. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, earned respect from German generals not for tactical genius but for political skill and strategic vision. German officers acknowledged that Eisenhower managed the complex Anglo-American alliance effectively, that he kept disparate forces working toward common objectives, and that he understood the relationship between military operations and political goals. Von Rundstedt called Eisenhower the ablest of the German generals' Allied opponents. German generals also developed opinions about specific American commanders. George Patton was seen as dangerous and unpredictable, a general who fought with the aggression and speed that German doctrine prized. One German general said, "Patton fights like a German general. He takes risks. He moves fast. He does not wait for perfect conditions. If all American generals had been like Patton, the war would have ended sooner." Omar Bradley was seen as solid and competent, but not imaginative, a general who executed plans well but rarely showed brilliance. Courtney Hodges was respected for professionalism but not feared. Mark Clark, who commanded in Italy, was viewed as ambitious and sometimes reckless, a general who sought glory more than he should have. But German generals understood that individual American commanders mattered less than the system supporting them. American generals had resources that German commanders could only dream of. They had unlimited artillery ammunition, complete air superiority, fleets of trucks to move supplies, replacement systems that kept units at strength. A mediocre American general with these resources could achieve more than a brilliant German general with a decimated force and no supplies. This understanding led to a certain fatalism among senior German officers by 1944. They knew Germany was losing the war. They knew that no amount of tactical skill could overcome Allied material superiority, but they were soldiers bound by duty and tradition to keep fighting until ordered to stop or until resistance became physically impossible. Some German generals tried to negotiate with the Western Allies, hoping to arrange a separate peace that would allow Germany to continue fighting only against the Soviets. These approaches went nowhere. The Allies had agreed to demand unconditional surrender, and they would accept nothing less. But the fact that German generals preferred dealing with Americans over Soviets was itself a form of respect. They believed Americans were rational, honorable, capable of negotiation. They feared Soviets would be vengeful and brutal. Von Rundstedt's assessment of American military capabilities delivered to interrogators after his capture was brutally honest. "We were better trained soldiers, we had better tactical doctrine, we had superior battlefield leadership at the company and battalion level. But you had more of everything. You had unlimited artillery, complete air superiority, infinite supplies. And you learned quickly. By 1944, American forces were as capable as any in the world. Not because American soldiers were naturally superior to German soldiers, but because America as a nation was capable of mobilizing resources more effectively than Germany." This was the final professional assessment from Germany's senior military leadership. American victory was not primarily due to superior fighting ability at the individual or small unit level. It was due to superior national mobilization, superior industrial capacity, superior logistics, and a military system that could learn from mistakes and adapt quickly. The American way of war, which seemed wasteful and ungainly to German military minds, was actually perfectly suited to American strengths. The general's perspective thus aligned with that of frontline soldiers, with greater understanding of why American methods worked. Both the private in a foxhole and the field marshal in the headquarters recognized American material superiority, but the field marshal understood that the superiority was not accidental. It was the product of a democratic system that could mobilize resources more effectively than totalitarianism, an industrial economy that could outproduce all competitors, and a logistical system that could project power across oceans and sustain it for years. In their prison camps and during post-war interviews, German generals spoke with respect, sometimes approaching awe, about American industrial and logistical achievements. They had fought against the product of American factories and had been buried by it. Their professional pride was wounded by defeat, but their professional competence forced them to acknowledge that they had been beaten by a superior system, not just superior numbers.
Beyond tactical assessments and material calculations, the German perception of American soldiers had a psychological dimension. How did fighting Americans affect German morale? What did German soldiers fear? What gave them hope? And how did these psychological factors shape the final years of the war? German morale in the early years of the war had been high. Victories in Poland, France, and the early Russian campaigns seemed to validate Nazi propaganda about German superiority. Soldiers believed they were part of an invincible army fighting for a glorious cause. Even setbacks could be rationalized as temporary difficulties. The entry of the United States into the war began to erode this confidence. German soldiers, even those who believed Nazi propaganda about American weakness, understood that American industrial capacity was enormous. They had seen newsreels of American factories. They knew that American production of tanks, aircraft, and ships exceeded that of all other nations. The question was not whether America could produce war materials, but whether American soldiers could use them effectively. Kasserine Pass temporarily reassured German soldiers that Americans, despite their equipment, could be defeated, but this reassurance faded as American performance improved. Each subsequent battle showed Americans learning, adapting, becoming more dangerous. By 1944, German soldiers no longer believed that superior German training and tactics could overcome American material superiority. The psychological impact of American firepower was immense. German soldiers described the terror of being subjected to American artillery barrages, knowing that shells would keep falling for hours, that there was no way to fight back, that survival was pure chance. One German soldier said, "You cannot fight artillery, you can only endure it," and the Americans had so much artillery that enduring it became impossible. Men broke under that kind of pressure, even experienced soldiers. American air superiority had similar psychological effects. German soldiers learned that moving by day meant death. Supply convoys that tried to reach the front in daylight were destroyed. Tanks caught in the open were hunted by fighter bombers. Even individual soldiers walking on roads risked being strafed. This constant threat from above created a sense of helplessness. German soldiers could do nothing to protect themselves except hide and hope American pilots did not spot them. The psychological advantage of defending on one's own soil was offset by the knowledge that Germany was losing the war. By 1945, German soldiers fighting in Germany knew their families were being bombed, their cities destroyed, their country overrun. Some fought harder, defending their homeland with desperate determination, but others saw no point in prolonging the inevitable and looked for opportunities to surrender. Nazi propaganda attempted to maintain morale by portraying Americans as barbaric, as criminals who would murder German prisoners and rape German women. But German soldiers who surrendered to Americans and survived to tell about it contradicted this propaganda. Word spread through German units that Americans treated prisoners well, that surrender was not death but safety. This knowledge affected German willingness to fight to the last.
Fear of Soviet revenge drove German behavior in the final months. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers knew what fate awaited them if captured. Soviet forces had suffered horrific losses at German hands. Soviet civilians had been murdered by the millions. Soviet prisoners had been deliberately starved. Germans who fell into Soviet hands could expect brutal treatment or execution. This fear kept German soldiers on the Eastern Front fighting even when resistance was hopeless. But on the Western Front, German soldiers increasingly saw surrender to Americans as an acceptable, even preferable outcome. They were still soldiers, bound by duty to obey orders and defend their positions. But when positions became untenable, when resistance became futile, German soldiers chose surrender to Americans over death. This was a form of psychological defeat, the recognition that continuing to fight served no purpose except prolonging suffering. American psychological warfare operations contributed to this erosion of German morale. Leaflets dropped on German positions promised good treatment for prisoners, provided information about German defeats elsewhere, and encouraged surrender. Safe conduct passes were distributed, guaranteeing humane treatment. These efforts were most effective when they aligned with reality. German soldiers who surrendered and were treated well validated the promises in the leaflets. When newly captured prisoners reported that they had been fed and given medical care, other German soldiers became more willing to surrender. The myth of American military incompetence, so prevalent after Kasserine Pass, became psychologically important in maintaining German morale. As long as German soldiers could believe they were better individual fighters than Americans, they could rationalize their defeats as merely the result of overwhelming numbers. This allowed them to maintain pride in their professional skill, even as they lost battle after battle. But this myth became increasingly difficult to sustain as American tactical competence improved. By late 1944, German soldiers no longer credibly claimed that Americans were poor fighters who only won through material superiority. Americans had demonstrated skill in amphibious operations, airborne assaults, combined arms warfare, and urban combat. They had produced generals capable of matching German operational commanders. Individual American soldiers had proven themselves capable of fighting with determination and courage. The psychological shock of this realization was profound. If Americans were becoming as skilled as Germans while retaining their material advantages, how could Germany possibly win? This question haunted German soldiers in the final months of the war. Some refused to accept it, clinging to hopes of miracle weapons or political divisions among the Allies. Others accepted defeat as inevitable and focused on surviving until war's end. German soldiers' respect for American determination was itself psychologically significant. Germans had been taught that democratic societies were soft, that Americans lacked the will to endure hardship. Combat experience proved otherwise. Americans did not give up. They absorbed casualties and kept attacking. They lost battles and came back to fight again. This stubbornness, this refusal to accept defeat, was itself a form of psychological warfare. It told German soldiers that no victory would be final, that even destroying American units would not stop the American advance, that the only end to the war would be German surrender or complete German annihilation. In the final psychological assessment, German soldiers came to see American forces as inevitable rather than invincible. American soldiers could be killed, American attacks could be repelled, American units could be defeated, but American power as a whole could not be stopped. There would always be more American soldiers, more American tanks, more American shells. The steel hurricane would continue until German resistance ended. This psychological exhaustion, combined with material depletion and the knowledge that Germany's cause was lost, broke German military effectiveness more surely than any tactical defeat. Soldiers who had fought skillfully for years lost the will to continue. Units that had held firm under terrible pressure began to disintegrate. The German army did not collapse all at once, but eroded slowly as individual soldiers and units decided that further fighting served no purpose. The American contribution to this psychological defeat was not just material, but moral. German soldiers saw that Americans fought for something beyond glory or conquest. They fought to end tyranny, to liberate occupied nations, to restore freedom. This gave American soldiers a psychological advantage. They knew why they were fighting. They believed their cause was just. This belief sustained them through hardships and gave them resilience that surprised German opponents. In the end, the psychological dimension of German perceptions of American soldiers was perhaps more important than tactical assessments. German soldiers could rationalize tactical defeats, they could maintain pride in their professional skill, but they could not sustain morale in the face of an enemy that would not quit, that grew stronger with each passing month, and that fought for principles that even some German soldiers, in their hearts, recognized as right.
On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. The war in Europe was over. Millions of German soldiers laid down their arms and entered captivity. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable military force in the world, had been destroyed. And with that destruction came the final evolution of German perceptions of American soldiers. In the years immediately after the war, German veterans wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and reflected on their experiences. Their assessments of American fighting ability had undergone a complete transformation from the contempt of 1943 to something approaching respect, even admiration, by 1945. This transformation was not universal. Some German veterans, particularly those who remained committed to Nazi ideology, continued to believe that German soldiers had been superior and that defeat was due only to overwhelming numbers. But most German veterans acknowledged that American forces had become genuinely formidable. A former German paratrooper interviewed decades after the war summed up this evolution. "When we first encountered Americans in Tunisia, we thought they were a joke. Well-equipped but poorly trained, badly led, quick to panic. We defeated them easily and assumed all American soldiers would be like this. But we were wrong. The Americans learned faster than any army I have ever seen. Within months, they were competent. Within a year, they were dangerous. By the time they landed in Normandy, they were professionals. They still relied on firepower more than we would have, but they used that firepower with devastating efficiency. In the end, they beat us not just because they had more resources, but because they learned to use those resources better than we could use ours." This acknowledgement that American victory was earned, not just bought with industrial capacity, marked a significant shift in German military thinking. It challenged the comforting narrative that German soldiers had been superior fighters, undone only by numbers. The reality was more complex. Americans had indeed enjoyed material advantages, but they had also developed tactical competence, operational skill, and strategic vision that matched or exceeded German capabilities in many areas. The logistical and industrial dimension of American power continued to amaze German veterans. They had fought an enemy that could replace losses faster than those losses could be inflicted. They had seen American units destroyed in battle, only to be reconstituted within days with fresh troops and new equipment. They had watched American supply columns stretching for miles, bringing food, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in quantities that seemed impossible. One German logistics officer, reflecting on his experience, said, "We lost the war in the factories and on the roads, not on the battlefields. Every battle we won cost us resources we could not replace. Every battle the Americans lost, they simply requisitioned more resources from their inexhaustible factories. We could kill 10 Americans for every German lost, and still they grew stronger while we grew weaker. That is how modern wars are won, not by brave soldiers, but by productive factories." The transformation of German perceptions also reflected a broader understanding of what the war had been about. Many German soldiers, particularly younger ones who had been drafted rather than volunteering, came to understand that they had fought for an evil cause. The atrocities committed in Germany's name, the Holocaust, the murder of civilians, the aggressive wars of conquest, these became impossible to deny as evidence emerged after the war. This understanding shaped how German veterans viewed their American captors. Americans had fought to defeat tyranny and restore freedom. They had treated German prisoners humanely, adhering to international law even when facing an enemy that had violated every norm of civilized warfare.
This moral superiority was acknowledged by many German veterans who recognized that American soldiers had fought for principles worth defending. Not all German veterans accepted this moral reckoning. Some maintained that they had been good soldiers following orders, that the crimes of the regime were not their responsibility, that they had fought honorably for their country regardless of who led it. But even these veterans, when pressed, acknowledged that American soldiers had fought skillfully and had earned their victory. The respect that developed between German and American veterans in the post-war years was remarkable. Former enemies met at battlefield commemorations, shared memories, and developed friendships. They had fought each other with determination and courage, and that shared experience created a bond stronger than nationality. German veterans spoke of American soldiers not as enemies, but as fellow warriors who had done their due. The historical significance of this transformation in German perceptions extends beyond military history. It represents a shift in how wars are understood and fought. The German military tradition emphasized individual skill, tactical brilliance, and warrior spirit. The American approach emphasized systematic organization, industrial capacity, and the ability to learn and adapt. The American victory validated the American approach and helped shape how modern militaries organize and train. The evolution of German opinions also reveals something about the American character. Americans in 1941 were not a martial people. They had no tradition of military excellence, no warrior culture, no belief in the glory of war. But when challenged, Americans built an army from scratch, trained millions of soldiers, developed new tactics and technologies, and fought with a determination that surprised their enemies and themselves. This transformation from civilian to soldier, from amateur to professional, from defeated at Kasserine to victorious at the Rhine, was quintessentially American. It reflected American optimism, American pragmatism, American willingness to learn from mistakes and try new approaches. German soldiers, with their rigid traditions and hierarchical culture, struggled to understand this flexibility, but they could not deny its effectiveness. In the final analysis, what did Germans really think about American soldiers in World War II? They thought Americans were amateurs who became professionals. They thought Americans relied too much on firepower, but used it with devastating efficiency. They thought Americans lacked the warrior tradition, but compensated with determination and industrial might. They thought American officers were sometimes mediocre, but that the American military system could succeed even with imperfect leadership. They thought American soldiers were not naturally superior fighters, but that they learned faster and adapted better than any army Germany faced. Above all, German soldiers learned to respect American military power not as an accident of geography or resources, but as a deliberate creation of a democratic society mobilized for total war. The factories that produced American equipment were built by American workers. The logistics system that supplied American armies was organized by American planners. The training that prepared American soldiers was designed by American officers who learned from experience and adopted their methods accordingly. This respect was earned through 3 years of combat, from the deserts of Tunisia to the forests of Germany. It was earned by American soldiers who landed on hostile beaches, who fought through hedgerows and mountains, who endured artillery barrages and winter cold, who kept advancing despite casualties and setbacks, who refused to quit until victory was achieved. The story of how German perceptions evolved from contempt to respect is the story of American determination, American learning, and American victory. It is a story worth remembering, worth studying, worth passing on to new generations who will face their own challenges and must find their own ways to overcome them. If you found this deep dive into German perspectives on American soldiers compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from Battlefield Secrets World War II. Subscribe to stay connected with these detailed historical explorations. Each story we tell adds another piece to our understanding of this defining conflict. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from? Did any of these German assessments surprise you? Our community spans the globe, from military history enthusiasts to descendants of veterans. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching.